new scientific discovery, and this changes things in a lot of different ways. Now, this comes to us from National Geographic, and it's a big one. Earth's core and magnetic field is now changing fast, according to a new study, which says that rapid sudden changes in the churning movement of Earth's liquid outer core is weakening the magnetic field in some regions of the planet's surface. And the findings suggest that quick changes are simultaneously occurring in the liquid metal 1,900 miles below the surface of our planet. One scientist involved in the study says the changes may suggest the possibility of an upcoming reversal of the geomagnetic field. So what does this mean for us? Well, I can actually talk about this for a full hour. Some people more eloquently about this topic than I can. There's a lot of interest in the magnetic field and theories about it shifting, even pole shifts. But in short, the decline in the magnetic field overall is opening the Earth's upper atmosphere to intensely charged particle radiation. We're a little bit more susceptible to all the stuff that's out there. And that includes asteroids, by the way. The particles can affect technical and radio equipment and can damage electronic equipment on satellites and airplanes. It also affects human and animal behavior as well. And the weather. Oddly enough, we are on the cusp of entering sunspot cycle 24, which is something that's been making the headlines recently over the course of the last year. But there are also reports coming out in the late 90s about how other planets in our solar system are heating up. Even some planets as far away as Pluto. They talked about Mars heating up. And so this also contradicts the official conspiracy theory as to what is causing global climate change. I also want to say that there is an Associated Press report out this week that talks about how CO2 contributes to the growth of plants. This is actually a scientific fact.
While a few women may also experience changes during these storms, they generally seem less affected by the sun's behavior. We too have magnetic fields which surround each of us. I think it is not unrealistic to conjecture what is happening externally is also happening internally. And the author writes, I believe current science will acknowledge this notion, showing the sun's charged particles and its influence on Earth's magnetic field is the core of rapid change taking place on the planet. And like this same effect occurs with human magnetic fields, ushering in a change or transition. Perhaps this is what our Mayan elders are trying to tell us. Reacting to changing hormonal levels, some men may become increasingly irritable and aggressive, while others may instead become more creative. I also think it amps up the sex drive just a little bit. If you look at fertility rates, they are also in line with solar maximum. An increase in solar activity is found to increase psychotic episodes in individuals who already suffer from unstable psychological states. While we may relate such behavior to a full moon, in 1963, Dr. Robert Becker and his colleague, Dr. Friedman, demonstrated that solar changes can also lead to noticeable increases in psychotic activity. Now, Bill, let's bring up some of those graphics showing the sunspot cycles. There's a whole bunch of pictures that we're going to show you at this point in time to get you to understand the data. Hopefully, you will be able to also yourself see the patterns. When we see lots of energy, solar activity, we also see certain wars taking place on the planet. The Revolutionary War, the Civil War, the Vietnam War, and also the late 60s and all the creativity going on. Solar maximum. The first time that the United States went into the Gulf, it only took a couple of days, 1991, solar maximum. Take a look at the graphics on the screen, and you can see what was taking place in the late 1990s. 9/11 and the War on Terror, so-called War on Terror. This current war that is not ending anytime soon. In fact, it's actually going to expand, and we'll get into that a little bit later in the broadcast. We'll talk about China. But you also see massive solar activity taking place in 2001, 2002, and 2003. In 2003, there was a power outage in New York City and Canada, and that was caused by a Class X solar flare, CME. We will now continue with this report, yet these reactions are not simply isolated to a few particularly sensitive or unlucky individuals. Evidence indicates that wars and international conflicts most often break out when sunspots are rapidly forming or rapidly decaying, as these are times when there are more intense geomagnetic storms. There's also another report that I encourage all of you to Google and research, this particular study that looks at deeper states of dreaming, lucid dreaming, being tied to geomagnetic storms, the magnetic field fluctuations actually having an impact on the fluid in our brain. In addition, this increase in solar activity also correlates to periods of more accidents and illness, as well as an increase of crimes and murders. The entire biosphere is affected by this electromagnetic pollution, and human behavior seems to react accordingly. Now, this is some of the early data, the early research that was done on the possibility of sunspots, solar activity being linked to human behavior. As early as 1915, some scientists were beginning to recognize connections between solar activity and human behavior. This work began with Russian scientist Alexander Chevitsky. I've never been good with Russian last names, who observed that mass changes in human behavior correlated to sunspot cycles. In the 1930s, Professor Raymond Wheeler, a historian at the University of Kansas, took this observation one step further. His research afforded numerical rankings to the severity of individual battles correlating to solar cycles. His data was statistically analyzed by Edward Dewey, who validated the existence of these war cycles, yet he was unable to make a definite connection with sunspot cycles because the data at that time was insufficient. In the 80s, with a more detailed analysis of Wheeler's data, the connection became clear. Upon close examination of the data, a pattern begins to emerge wherein wars are most likely to start in key points of the sunspot cycle. This is when the geomagnetic activity is changing most rapidly on the upsurge of solar activity, or the downward part of the cycle when sunspots are rapidly diminishing. In addition, we can also see how this affects psychological mechanisms such as altered brain rhythms and abnormal hormonal levels. In other words, wars are kind of a mass psychosis. War fever is real. With this in mind, should we view warring behavior as a type of disease? Are the related socio-political or economic factors as much of a symptom of solar cycles as the battles they appear to create? And if the data on this sunspot and the sunspot cycles points to an impending crisis, how can we best use this knowledge? When we see the connection to physical mechanisms, electromagnetic pollution, this gives us some predictive insight for when increased aggressions are likely to start. Calculations indicate that we're due to see another rise in solar activity, intense solar activity, in about 2 years, September 22nd, 2010. This was written 2 years ago. So the sun has been going through an extended solar minimum for some time. Now we're seeing more activity. Scientists are baffled. Fluctuations in the magnetic field, magnetic north moving in the direction of Russia away from Canada, and strange changes to the thermosphere. And these are just names that are being given to what man is trying to understand. It's no mystery that scientists are baffled. I would be baffled to see a scientist try to explain to me the nature of reality in the universe, because it's all based on theory, the current available data that exists at this particular point in time. Remember, there was a point in time where it was believed that the Earth was flat. Now with science, now with satellites, like the particular satellites that NASA is using, not that we can trust everything that's coming out of NASA. They were founded allegedly by Nazis, rocket propulsion scientists that worked for Hitler. The question is, how do we verify, double, triple, quadruple, verify the facts and data outside of NASA? Enter the European Space Agency. So all across the planet, we're seeing similar pieces of data outside of NASA being released to the public. The report goes on, as with any disease, if we are aware of the cause, we can take precautions to lessen the symptoms. In past writings on the subject, I have suggested that global meditation might be one tactic for steering this aggressive cycle another way. More information is available at burl.com. BURYL.com. Imagine how valuable it would be to mankind, or even an individual, if we were able to address a potentially volatile situation by carefully studying the pattern of history. How would this influence our decisions and actions, and how might this change our fate. Now, some of that stuff seems a little negative. Oh, agitation, male aggression, war. There's also consciousness, spikes in new ideas, new understandings, a different energy on the planet. We are affected by the charged particles. Some of you, are affected this week from the changes going on our planet. Some of you have written me your dreams. Some of them are very, very apocalyptic, more apocalyptic dreams. It's so strange how I'm in so many people's dreams. But you don't have to look at this in a negative way. This is empowering information. It's also a great time to meditate, to do martial arts, to do Tai Chi, to work on that energy between your hands, deep breathing when we go through cycles of change just like this.
This is a very special video report on the CMEs, the coronal mass ejections, the solar flares that are actually impacting Earth right now. No, it's not the end of the world. It is actually, though, the beginning of many changes coming to our world. On Sunday, August 1st, 2010, not one, not two, but 4 CMEs were detected being ejected from the sun, heading directly towards planet Earth. Beginning last night, we saw one flare hit the Earth, creating the aurora borealis effect throughout many parts of the country, many parts of the world. And in fact, tonight, on the 4th day of August, we're about to see more CMEs. The event is sparking controversy and debate around the internet. Is this the end of the world, or is this something completely natural? As someone that's been studying solar flares for about 2 to 3 years now, I feel it's important that I make this video the beginning of a series of videos about this very important subject, this change to our world, but not the beginning of the end of the world. There is some disinformation out there, and I got to clear up some things just to make sure people are aware of what's already been discovered previous to this particular event. I wrote an article called Sunspot Cycle 24 and the Earth's Weakening Magnetic Field about 2 years ago, noting and documenting the scientific claims and facts that the magnetic field has holes in it now, and that as recently as several weeks ago, they've detected major changes with our Earth's outer atmosphere, the thermosphere. And so what happens when we have changes to our magnetic field, the very thing that protects us from gamma rays, asteroids, things of that nature, is that we have a thinner veil. That means more things from the sun, different types of radiation, different forms of energy can actually get through, penetrate the Earth's magnetic field and affect us. Now, in this video, I'm going to ask that you keep an open mind and start thinking about ways that we can be affected by solar flares outside of a negative way, outside of something that could be called disastrous, like a massive earthquake that kills millions of people. What could be some of the positive effects of solar flares? And if you look at different tribes throughout history, if you look at man's understanding of the sun, if you look at the very fact that man has had many sun-worshiping societies within it, it does raise the question, what is it about the sun and solar maximums that are looked on as a positive thing throughout society? Sun is constantly attributed to the very thing that gives us life, that allows the light to come into this, that provides the light in this world of ours, that produces the food, that gives the plants the fuel that they need, the energy that they need, photosynthesis, to keep our hearts beating. The important thing is to look at the future, 2012, with a more objective perspective than a doomsday end-all mentality, or the other extreme, the perspective that what's coming is not going to affect us at all, our world that is. And the reality is, yesterday's solar flare affected U.S. Bank. It's in the news. There already were bank failures today from a very small, considerably small Class C solar flare. And so the reality is, all of this stuff is coming up to a head, and what happened in the last 24 hours should not only be a warning to those of you out there that are dependent on your ATM cards and the grid, but also a wake-up call that this is in fact not a conspiracy theory. We are in fact guests on this planet that we choose to call Earth, and we are going through a natural cycle that actually has just begun. And so over the course of the next 3 years, this solar maximum, the solar flare cycle, it's going to peak in 2013, is going to bring us a lot of change. I suggest that you look into areas and how it affects man's psyche, our moods, fertility rates, even cycles of war seem to be tied into solar maximum, which I find it really interesting how all of these tensions with China the economic situation, but also the U.S. military being in the Yellow Sea and the Korean Peninsula, all the drumbeats that are beating right now as they try to direct the people to war, the Pied Pipers, that is, trying to direct the people into another crisis. We have to be aware of what's happening energetically above us. In the future, I'm going to have more videos that are going to be coming out, but be aware that moods are going to be slightly different during these times. Some people act like they're batshit crazy, and some people might appear to be a little bit more enlightened than the rest of the month because of the way that they're experiencing this energy, the charged particles, really, that have entered our atmosphere. So I hope that you'll start taking a look more openly at Sunspot Cycle 24. And remember, always, above all, do your own research. If you really want to know what's going on with the sun and its effect on us, its effect on consciousness, we have to think outside the box of the mainstream media and start making our own decisions for ourselves. Thank you for watching.
Pattern recognition is what we're looking at here with the connection between peaks in solar cycles, solar activities, times of solar maximum, and the launching of new battles, wars, conflicts, false flag events, specifically at certain times. And we're going to be looking at a number of individuals that have provided information about the quantitative information that everybody has access to in terms of these solar cycles. And Alexander Chavinsky is one of the most historical figures. He was an acclaimed scientist in Russia. He studied the biological effects of the sun and universe. In particular, how mouse changes in human behavior correlated to sunspot cycles. In 1915, he started to look in this direction at the effects of the sun. He spent a summer observing the sun and first hypothesized the effect of periodic changes in solar activity on the organic world. In 1916, he entered the front lines of World War I, and it was there that he first discovered that battles tended to wax and wane with the strength of solar flares and geomagnetic storms. He constructed what's called the Index of Mass Human Excitability, which traced the incidence of wars, revolutions, riots, expeditions, and migrations from 500 BC to 1922 AD. And he was jailed for his research by Stalin in 1942. He asked Chevetsky to retract his writings in solar cycles, which contradicted Soviet theories of the reasons for the Russian revolutions of 1905 and 1917. So he did 8 years in a forced labor gulag, followed by 8 years of Soviet rehabilitation, where he then conducted scientific work in the coal mines. Of course, Russia did commemorate Alexander Chevetsky, but it was a little too late. But his research spawned other studies. For example, Raymond Wheeler from the University of Kansas confirmed that the pattern, in fact, does span human history as far back as 2,500 years. He found that intense magnetic upswings directly affect the human brain and at times drove mankind into deadly emotional tantrums and frenzied killing sprees. He also wrote a book entitled Climate, the Key to Understanding Business Cycles. Edward Dewey found his information and statistically analyzed it. He's the founder of the Foundation for the Study of Cycles. Dewey validated the existence of these war cycles, and he described the 4 components of Chizevsky's 11-year cycle and their appropriate links. And this kind of illustrates the 4 cycles. The blue section, the yellow, the red, and the yellow again. Dewey wrote in 1970 that knowing that wars have a cyclical nature related to sunspot cycles implies that they have a common cause, and therefore they are predictable. If so, maybe they can be avoided. But for the powers that be, and their perspective on things, events can be staged. People can be manipulated, especially if they're out of balance and out of alignment with their own truth. Dr. Robert Becker and Dr. Friedman also looked at this information and found that more people flip out at times of increased geomagnetic activity and that there was an increase in psychiatric hospital admissions. Now, Carol Moore has a website, entitled Sunspots and Activist Strategy. And I'm going to read a quote that I feel is very pertinent to what we just discussed and also where we could be going. Governmental leaders often respond to mass protests by starting wars to unite the people and suppress dissent. Also, they themselves may get caught up in the mania caused by negative ionization and launch irrational wars. Activists since the 1960s, like myself, have lived through several sunspot heights. From 68 to 71, 79 to 82, 89 to 1992, and the 2000 to 2003 periods. We can look back at our own experiences of several years of frenzied activity with big meetings and big protests, when the least indignation might lead to riots, rebellions, revolutions, civil wars. And we can remember other periods of years where once vital organizations declined or died. Meetings and protests were fewer and smaller, and lethargic people seemed to be willing to endure repression. Then, just when few remaining activists were in deep despair, a magical resurgence of activity. If governmental intelligence agencies are on their toes, they have bookmarked this page, and they have experts studying the effects of sunspots on activism so they can squelch or even redirect such energies when they rise again. There are many examples of this. So it's hardly silly for activists also to look at the evidence that these cycles have influenced all of human history and to learn the implications of these cycles for activist organizing today and in the future. I've been talking to this guy over email for several years, and I feel that the work of Dr. Burl Payne needs to reach a larger audience, and I'm hoping that through this presentation, more people will look at what Dr. Burl Payne has been researching for several years, actually since the 1970s. Dr. Burl Payne is a PhD in psychology and a master's in physics. In the 1980s, he found that the start of the warring behavior occurred on the ascent or the descent of the sunspot cycle, and that the physical mechanism to trigger this was changes to the Earth's geomagnetic field, which affects brain rhythms and hormone balance of sensitive individuals. This is an illustration of that concept. This is a chart that he created showing where you can see here the conflicts, some of the conflicts beginning before the solar activity. You can see here examples of conflicts beginning after the peak in solar activity. Burl Payne suggests that men have their own cycle. We know that women have a cycle that's connected to the moon. It's called PMS. And Burl suggests that men that are out of balance may have their own cycle called MMS, or male macho syndrome. And he believes that during this point in time, through an increase in solar activity, solar energy, that men receive an increase in testosterone in their physical bodies. He writes, quote, "Wars could be called a mass psychosis or a new disease, which is not caused by bacteria or a virus. If warring behavior is perceived as a previously unknown type of mass psychosis, then the means for dealing with it becomes different than those traditionally employed. And those means have not worked very well." It gets even deeper in his book, Planetary Influences. He observed that when Mars, Venus, and Mercury were near the Earth at the same time period, more sunspot numbers were likely to form, and more wars were more likely to start if the sunspot cycle was either on the ascending or descending part of the 11-year solar cycle. And he found that there's a correlation 85% of the time between periods when planets are relatively near the Earth and the production of sunspots and other solar activity. There's also a quote from a famous metaphysical teacher called George Gurdjieff, who said in the 1940s that war is the result of planetary influences. So we're now going to go over the evidence, the historical events that have taken place in different solar cycles, beginning in the late 18th century, around the time of the Revolutionary War. And we're going to have to abbreviate this for time. But what we can see in this particular chart, and there's many charts, it would take a half hour to get into all the things that took place between 1770 and 2013. But we saw events that led to the American Revolution and sunspot cycle number 2. In sunspot cycle 3, we see the American Revolution. We see the U.S. Constitution being written in the third solar cycle. Solar cycle 5, Napoleon conquers Europe, 1803 to 1806. And a lot of other things taking place in Europe. Solar cycles 8 through 10. And we see events that led to the Civil War, for example, in the United States, which ironically started 2 years after the 1859 Carnarvon event, where the grid went down. The grid that did exist at that point in time. We also saw revolts beginning in India, Italy, and China. Solar cycles 11 through 13. U.S. labor strikes, revolts in Sudan, First Indian Congress meets. 1893 to 95, Zulu Revolt, Cuban Revolution. And we see events that led to World War I, solar cycles 14 through 16. And as I said earlier, solar cycle 14 was double peaked, as they're projecting that this current solar cycle could be double peaked, 2013 and 2015. 1914 to 1919, First World War, Irish and Indian revolts, Russian Revolution, and the atom split. In 1929, by the way, during the peak in sunspots, the peak of the solar activity, we saw the Great Depression. We saw the stock market crash, rather, that led to the bottoming out of the Great Depression around 1933. During the same time period, we see Mussolini and Hitler rising to power, built on economic unrest and other revolts, formation of the Red Army, more mass civil disobedience in India. Now we're looking at events that led to World War II, solar cycle 17 to 19. Spanish Civil War, Germany and Japan start World War II. Japanese rape of Nanking. Mass civil disobedience in India. U.S. still strike, 1947 to 1953. We see the Greek Civil War, Israeli-Arab War, India-Pakistan riots, Red Army wins China, Vietnam revolts, flying saucers start becoming more common throughout the United States. Following Project Paperclip, there's also a crash of a flying saucer in Roswell during the peak of that solar cycle. The CIA was created out of the OSS, and we saw the launch of the Korean War. And we see other events following that. The late 60s took place during solar maximum, solar cycle 20, 1967 to 1969. And by the way, these years that I'm reading, that's the years that we had the peak. It usually goes from 3 to 5 years. Each solar cycle, it varies. Sometimes it's short, sometimes it's a little bit longer. Height of the Vietnam War, peace demonstrations, worldwide student uprising, Czechoslovakian uprising, USSR invasions, in U.S. inner-city riots, Israeli-Arab War, Woodstock and height of hippie movement, uprising in France, Prague Spring moon landing, MLK and Bobby Kennedy assassinated. And there's a lot more things that take place in the next cycle. For example, when Afghanistan was invaded by Russia, it took place during solar cycle 21. The Iraq-Iran war began during that solar cycle. The Shah of Iran was overthrown. In the 1988 to 1992 period, we see a number of other events that are extremely historic. For example, the USSR begins to pull out from Afghanistan, and we see the staged collapse of the Soviet Union. We also saw the Tiananmen Square incident in China, and the Berlin Wall fell, the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Iraqi troops invade Kuwait. Bush Sr. gives New World Order speech. The Gulf War begins. We also saw the LA riots, all during solar cycle 22. In the next solar cycle 23, and there's a lot of things that started to kick off as we approach the millennium point in time. For example, the WTO protests in 1999, and other protests that were starting to increase at that point in time, and yet 9/11 hadn't even happened yet. But already the masses were reacting to these changes that they were feeling in their bodies. We saw the worldwide Y2K scare. Heroin overdoses skyrocket in Portland. Bush is given the election by the Supreme Court. And the 2001 to 2003 period. September 11th, 2001. I don't know if we use that typo there. So-called war on terrorism begins. Invasion of Afghanistan. Patriot Act signed into law. The invasion of Iraq. Because, again, these aren't wars. These are invasions. And, of course, mass protests against the war. Before they invaded Iraq, as we all remember, record numbers of protests, as well as afterwards. As we started going into the minimum, alternative media continued to expand, but protest numbers got smaller and smaller and smaller, obviously, especially after the so-called election of the last so-called president. So solar flex, 2001 to 2002. We can see from this chart that solar activity starts to ramp up right before 9/11 and continues to maintain its strength throughout the period of time where they invaded Afghanistan. And it starts to decline slightly in activity in 2002, but this is still the center of the maximum portion. We started going in the minimum phase around 2003, 2004. This is what we have seen in the last couple of years in this cycle, number 24. Descent in Tunisia, Egypt, Yemen, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia. Obama overthrows Libya. By the way, 8 years to the day that Bush attacked Iraq. Bush attacked Iraq March 19th, 2003. Libya was struck March 19th, 2011. And of course, we started to see media coverage of protests all over the world, not only in the Middle East, but Europe, China, and many other countries. And the United States, not limited to Occupy Wall Street. Also during this period, we saw Fukushima. In March of 2011, President Barack Obama signed the NDAA, Syrian Civil War. North Korea, the controlled wild card, points missiles at South Korea and threatens Hawaii and Japan. And of course, after the biggest solar flare this year, that took place on April 11th, 2013, we saw the Boston staged false flag bombing. Engineered at a specific point in the timeline, where people are most likely to react emotionally with fear to such an event. So there are also trends with economic cycles and the sun. And this chart was put together by Michael Manderville. And the arrows that I put here indicate the recession periods. So here we see on the left side of the screen, we see the Great Depression, which began during a solar peak. And we see other events, other recessions. This chart is 1986 to 2003. And we see the Bush Senior recession right here, and the dot-com bubble bursting right here. And when I looked at this chart, a couple things came to mind. Because during solar minimums, there's less human activity, or as Stravinsky calls it, human excitability. So when I saw that in 1913, there was a record low numbers of sunspots that occurred in that year. That was the year the Federal Reserve was created. If we look at 2008, that's when the banker bailout was initiated. Also a record low sunspot count year. Less activity, less expected response from human beings, less expected protests, more times to launch things when you don't want people to react to things that you launch. So they use the maximum cycle, and they also use the minimum. And notice how Occupy Wall Street took a couple of years to get moving after this 2008 launched the banker bailout scheme. In late 2011, sunspots increased, and that was around the same time period we saw an increase in protests and other things. So solar cycles in the arts, human creativity, new ideas, music, movies, trends, pop culture, so many different changes, be they positive or negative, that's all in the eye of the beholder and the level of consciousness of the people experiencing the changes on the earth. Now, the powers that be use the solar cycle by staging events, panics, wars. This is a really critical part of my presentation, which we have very little time for. But they do this to provoke a certain emotional response in human beings on earth that are flooded with an excess level of energy in the human body. A sophisticated strategic use of problem reaction solution, launching certain projects forward during solar peaks and celestial events, based on the belief that their luck will be magnified. Moving certain goals forward, as I said earlier, during minimums, when they expect the least amount of resistance. Dark occultists behind the powers that be understand the makeup of the human body and our stress responses. Here's what's very interesting. On 9/11, at the specific time that the major events were being televised, the first plane hitting the tower, the second plane hitting the tower, the second building falling, then the first building falling. During those points, those times of the day, there were changes in the Earth's magnetic field, suggesting that human beings, through the emotion of fear, were somehow impacting the magnetic field. And you've heard from David Icke and others that they're feeding on our fear. These are archonic forces. So if they know that when we respond to fear, we change the field this way, it gets very, very interesting. Here's something from NOAA and NASA that also confirms the magnetic flux on 9/11. The realities we have to face is that we're at different levels of our ability to be grounded and deal with this information, to deal with the energy coming in from the sun. And some people are more insusceptible than others. Some people just prefer to be controlled or control others. This is why we can't have a collective shift in consciousness as long as some people are still choosing to remain in a slave state of consciousness. Human beings that are out of alignment with their own truth are the most susceptible to having their perceptions and emotions used against them. So I think the game plan for the remainder of the cycle is to continue to manufacture a civil war and prop up external threats and internal threats. And in terms of the manufactured civil war, we're looking at the gun issue that they're bringing out, pushing people against the wall, hoping people react emotionally. And I see a lot of that. A lot of people's Facebook posts, they're saying that they're ready for a revolution. They're putting themselves out there saying things they probably shouldn't say. Launch new proxy wars, conflicts, military interventions in Africa, Middle East, and Asia. The next solar cycle, the staging of World War III between China, Russia, and the United States, not until 2020. And there's a lot of quantitative information, and it doesn't mean that we can't change it, but there's a lot of quantitative information that they want to go in this direction. And my next documentary film is going to address that issue. How solar activity impacts human beings, chronobiology, is an overview. How we're affected by the sun, different hours of the day. But that's just the start. It gets deeper, much deeper. How solar activity impacts human beings. It's neutral. It's not good, bad, evil, positive, negative. It's energy. And how we are responding to that energy, it's different. We respond to this in different ways. The sun brings a cycle of birth and death, or creation and destruction. Solar flares affect the central nervous system, all brain activity, including the pineal gland, including equilibrium along with human behavior and all psychological, mental, emotional responses, and just about every other aspect of the body. New scientists have talked about it. Does the Earth's magnetic field cause suicides? And what's most interesting about it, there's also been lots of studies on how magnetic fields, natural ones and artificially created ones in labs, can cause changes in the brainwave state, can cause changes in our cells. But here's what's really interesting. The pineal gland, which is in the center of our consciousness, the center of our mind, has a concentration of magnetite. Magnetite was not discovered until 1992 in the human brain, but it was discovered in the 1960s. In birds, fish, and other migratory animals. This is how we are connected to each other. The magnetite in our brain, that telepathic sixth sense. Evidence shows that magnetite is a transducer, linking ambient electromagnetic activity to cellular function. And in the pineal gland, there is a concentration of magnetic crystals. Study finds human eye also emits light, and that we have a sixth sense in our eyes. We're not aware of it consciously, but we're aware of it subconsciously. We have to ground ourselves. Get engaged in exercises that lets you release that energy. Body movements that engage chi energy, like martial arts, dancing, qigong, yoga. Being in nature, the body loves that. Traveling, camping. Creative applications of the mind, like writing, building new structures or homes. Creating art, music, documentary films, and it's very important to drink healthy water. And of course, healthy food. Several types of meditations that you can use, from deep breathing to relax yourself. to Vipassana meditation, which is observing your breath as it naturally is, becoming very aware and equanimous at the same time, sun gazing, and of course listening to certain tones and frequencies to bring the human body back into balance, and a grounding cord meditation to ground yourself, not just breathe deep or observe your breath, but to practice in your mind, typing your clairvoyant muscles, your ability to heal yourself. And this will help you with your creative and manifestation abilities. Together, we can use the mind's ability to affect change at certain points in the timeline. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that we are more capable of manifestation during this particular point in time.
The sun, it's neutral. It's neither positive nor negative. The change that it brings is dependent on the level of consciousness of an individual. That's basically having a bombardment of energy via solar particles coming into their body. If their energy is blocked, if they're in a lower emotional state, if they don't know what's happening to them, violence can happen. Suicides can happen. There's shifts taking place in the brain. We have magnetite in the brain. If someone doesn't know that all of a sudden you're going to start seeing things in a different way, they flip out. So we see an increase in hospital admissions, for psychiatric outbursts and things of that nature.
Is that also connected to the moon?
The moon definitely magnifies all the effects of the sun. There's also planetary influences over the sun. And things like when Mercury, Venus, or other planets are near the Earth or the sun or in alignment, it causes sunspots to increase. So there's a lot of factors involved in, how intense a sunspot cycle is going to be.
Well, in the last moments here of our talk, what can we do to protect ourselves and use this to our advantage? I mean, because that ultimately is the question. We can sit here and focus on the fear and how the powers that shouldn't be have used it against us, but what do we do to use it to aid us?
That's actually the most important thing, and all the other piece of information is pretty much a stepping stone to get to this conclusionary section, of which I want to expand on in future work. But maintaining a healthy body, mind, and spirit is essential as far as an individual solution before we get to what a group can do. We have different levels of sensitivity. I'm a Pisces. I'm a lot more sensitive to energy, to thoughts, to vibrations than other star signs. It's a water sign. And some people that are more sensitive to some of these things, and there's a lot of other people, they need to work even harder to ground themselves. It can be difficult even being in a left brain dominated society, because we become more right brain. And when this energy is coming in, there's new ideas that come with that new energy. There's new ideas for new possibilities to manifest. On a physical level, a lot of the reasons you see some of the violence, a lot of the reasons you see some of the conflicts is an excess of energy in the body. What we do is release the energy in the body, and through basic exercise, whatever someone's favorite form of exercise, be it running, hiking, skiing, basketball, whatever, that's one level. But then there's body movements that deal with the energy in the hands.
Tai Chi or Falun
Tai
Gong.
Chi, ancient forms of martial arts, not the MMA, and training without anger in your heart, and realizing that this is about the universal ki or chi or prana that's inside the human body. Sufis will spin around and around and around in order to tap into that spiraling force that's around all things. And Burl Payne wrote a book called The Spin Force. And in this book, burlbooks.com, it's his website, he documents how someone can build a device that detects the strength of the spin force around a human being. And he found that it's strongest at the time of full moons. It's the strongest at the time of geomagnetic storms. And when you look for this and you Google the spin force, you'll see a pyramid. 4 sticks this way, 4 magnets. And it rotates either clockwise or counterclockwise. And he's got one of these in a jar, and it's dangling from the top. So different people will come up and put their hands around it. Sometimes it'll move, sometimes it won't move. It seemed to be the calmest, according to Burl's research, when someone was in a meditative state. But if their emotions were excited, whether they were positive or negative, it was more active. You can also get a pendulum.
And if you hold your palm this way, it will go either circular, clockwise, or counterclockwise.
They also do that to try to
Right.
figure out the gender of a baby. When a lady's pregnant, they use
Interesting.
a very similar test, and if it goes one way, it's a male, and if it's, the accuracy on that is startlingly pretty darn high.
It's really interesting.
So, but I'm sorry, go ahead.
When you turn your hand this way, the pendulum on its own will also start moving vertically. So I was messing around with this as a kid. I'm going, whoa. There's a spin force in the hand. One other way to detect the magnetic field is with the use of dowsing rods.
Yes.
Now that's all what someone individually can do, and of course, healthy water, healthy food,
Fluoride-free, GMO-free.
and many examples I can mention. But I want to close here, dealing with using your mind, creating things, Renaissance of the arts, you name it, music, creating documentary films, alternative media. Now, what can we do collectively? Masses tend to come together during solar maximum, so this can either be done mindfully and be aware of what's going on, or it could be a chaotic scenario.
Yeah.
You know, not all protests are peaceful, and I've
Sure.
seen some crazy shit go down in Portland. These solar cycles, small ones and large ones. People can look up people like Maurice Cottrell on Coast to Coast, and he'll take you down the different types of cycles. But this 2012 one we just went through was just one of many. And it's still going to take some time to see the effects of whatever galactic center we're going through. But when we see these major renaissances throughout time, you can see peaks in solar activity and changes in climate. And I did a keynote presentation. It's the one thing that got me out of the desert, Vincent, and I really needed it. It was in April of this year. They flew me to Philadelphia, and I gave a 200 slideshow presentation on the sun's effect on consciousness, but cycles of war. We can see periods where events that have been staged by them have occurred in peaks in solar activity. 9/11 is the best example of our day. And we can go from 9/11, even the day of 9/11, we were seeing fluctuations in the magnetic field the moment that those towers were hit by the planes, and the moment that those buildings came down. And scientists took a closer look at this. The fear generated by all those people watching at the same time, those events on TV were somehow affecting the magnetic field. And there is so much evidence that there is a direct connection between our consciousness and the field of the Earth itself. Now, when we see more solar flares hit the Earth, we go through magnetic flux. We see geomagnetic storms, like they talk about on spaceweather.com. You can sign up and get the updates in your email. And you may also start to see the patterns as I started tracking 4 years ago. People getting in fights, domestic stuff. You may find yourself pissed off and just ready to blow. And you're going, why do I feel this way? And you find out, oh my God, we were just hit by a solar flare. There's something about the human body and our aura, our own magnetic field, that is affected by these changes. And I have concluded it's not conclusively, altruistically, absolutely positive and enlightening and heart-opening. It can be very chaotic and freaky. And how people respond to these magnetic fluxes, geomagnetic storms, is in direct relation to the level of their consciousness, or if they're able to handle that energy in their body. This is why I see patterns of more heroin addiction, alcoholism, smoking, other forms of escapism during solar peaks, because as humans, we get flooded with the energy. It's fight or flight on another level, on a more subtle level. We see more babies born. We also see more divorces. Is that because human beings are more hornier for more energy coming in from the sun? See, we start asking questions as to why does society have certain trends? When we go beyond just physical realities and the economy and the war and earth level events, when we go higher, we see these larger patterns. And
Something
we are
tells
going...
me that it's a reciprocal relationship, that the sun affects us and we also affect the sun. Ergo, it must be possible for human beings to actually create their own renaissance without really the need of the sun to do it for us to a degree. It's kind of like the Van Allen radiation belt. The Earth produces itself these kind of dual
Right.
sort of mushroom-shaped auras around its northern and southern hemispheres, and it actually
Right.
produces this radiation belt. It's a big magnetic field, and it protects it, but it also affects other things around it negatively. And this is something that the people who were traveling through space earlier were really worried about when they went to the moon, or allegedly went to the moon. that they thought that they might be cooked in their little space capsules like an egg.
Right.
And what I find very interesting is that they've now done studies of humans as well, and it turns out that the heart actually produces a very similar looking magnetic field around it as well. So it's like the fractal universe, as above, so below. Everything produces the same kind of thing. Like a cell looks like the Earth, a human body and its magnetic fields looks like the Earth. The revolving Andromeda galaxy looks like a cell, and so on and so forth.
Headline, it's almost time for the sun's magnetic field to do a flip. And I'll just note before I start reading this that there's been a lot of anticipation of this flip of the sun's magnetic field, of the poles, and I think that this affects our personalities in a big way. I think this whole theme of renewal and birth and death and things of that nature, of a fresh start, I think that we see, a general theme of this in our own lives when we go through these. It's just a suspicion. It's just a suspicion. But what I can tell you right now, just briefly, then I'll start reading the article, is that I'm seeing a lot of people get more involved in alternative media. I'm seeing a lot of people start new projects, and people from around the globe. They're just this theme, and it seems like a lot of people in their own personal lives that they've gone through some sort of renewal, or they're going through it. Seems like it's been a year of reflection for a lot of people. 2013 has not been all doom and gloom and disaster. Life really is what you make of it and how you look at it. So I would look at this story about the sun's magnetic field changing in a outside-the-box kind of way. Think about how changes like this might be affecting human consciousness. So the article, which just came out, notes that the sun's polarity is getting closer to flipping. The sun's northern hemisphere polarity is already reversed, and the southern hemisphere should follow suit soon. Every 11 years or so, the two hemispheres of the sun reverse their polarity, creating a ripple effect that can be felt throughout the far reaches of the solar system. The sun is currently going through one of those flips in its cycle. Scientists working at Stanford University's Wilcox Solar Observatory, which has monitored the sun's magnetic field since 1975. Solar physicist at Stanford said in a video about the polarity reversal, quote, "The sun's poles are reversing, and this is a large-scale process that takes place over a few months, but it happens once every 11 years. What we're looking at is really a reversal of the whole heliosphere, everything from the sun out past the planets," end quote. The polarity reversal builds up over time as sunspot spreads out, causing the sun's magnetic field to migrate from the equator of the star to one of the sun's poles. As this change occurs, the sun's magnetic field reduces to zero and then comes back with the opposite polarity. Of course, this is still quoting the same person. Todd Hoeksema, who is the solar physicist at Stanford. And he continues on, when that reverses, it affects us here on Earth because not only do we see more cosmic rays, but there is more activity on the sun. That activity comes in and it affects the Earth's magnetic field. And this is where I'm jumping in and I'm telling you, whoa, it affects humanity in a lot of different ways. And there's been a lot of study on this, but still people have yet to really find out and even imagine how our consciousness and our actions and behavior and our moods, emotions are in so many ways shaped by these solar flares, by these coronal mass ejections, these CMEs impacting our Earth's magnetic field. As above, so below. And in this holographic reality, we could see so much evidence of this oneness aspect, of this interconnectedness. And that's what I find to be very interesting about these particular changes that we're in right now. Going back to the article, the planet's magnetic field affects technology on Earth such as GPS systems and power grids. The uptick in solar activity can also create brilliant auroras on Earth and on certain planets of the solar system. We also see the effects of this on other planets. Jupiter has storms, Saturn has auroras. All this is driven by activity on the sun. And I mentioned this in my presentation briefly. There are many changes taking place in our universe, many changes taking place within the magnetic field of many planets. It almost seems like some planets are being terraformed, either naturally or by some other means, designed, if you will, to harbor physical life at a point later on in time. It seems that way. It's something that has my curiosity stirred. Going back to the article, this part of the sun cycle is known as the solar maximum. The solar max marks the peak in the sun's activity. Usually the sun's polarity reversal happens during this period of the solar cycle. However, the reversal isn't responsible for the increased number of solar flares and eruptions, known as coronal mass ejections, usually observed around solar max. The increased activity acts as an indicator, but the polarity reversal will occur, but it doesn't cause the sun to become more active. The polarity reversal probably won't harm Earth. In fact, it could even protect the planet in some ways, according to some scientists. And that's the article. I think the sun plays a huge role in the Earth's evolution, perhaps in the evolution of consciousness. It certainly plays a huge role in new directions and changes in society that we could see as positive or negative depending on, our perspective. But we are impacted in so many ways by the cycles of the sun. I have a suspicion that during solar maximum periods, that botanical life, people involved in growing vegetables or weed, that during those solar maximum years that they have better crops than solar minimum years. And that's just a guess. When I was out in the desert, I did spend a little bit of time talking with someone, visiting someone who was involved in growing lots of things, including sunflowers. And he had these massive sunflowers. And he was just noting that, he didn't know about the solar cycles. He was just noting something about this year, something about how they're responding. I mean, he'd been out there a decade. And it's this year that they're really, really starting to grow and be the tallest they've ever been. And I'm wondering if there's a connection between solar maximum and the growth of his plants. I'm very, very curious.
Alex Ansary here, coming to you now from the year 2014, December 21st specifically. Hope you enjoyed this special edition of Outside the Box TV with a special focus on solar flares and how they affect human consciousness for better or for worse. Obviously, it's a subject that I've been looking at least since 2007 and 2008, just like the plans for the stage-managed World War III scenario, which I think we could see in the peak of the next solar cycle. That would be solar cycle 25, in and around the years of 2025. Thank you for watching, and if this is a subject matter that you'd like to help me refine, expand, so on and so forth, my email is alex_ansary@hotmail.com, and I currently live in Portland, Oregon, USA.